Hello, adventurers, travelers, and wanderers, and lore hoarders. Grab a seat, grab a drink. Today, we're going to look at chapters 3, 6, and 10 from the Triumphs of a Monarch, beginning with chapter 3 at the Gates of Daggerfall. For a dozen years after the Battle of Grandin Tor, the kingdoms of High Rock were at peace, and the merchant ships of Wayrest, Daggerfall, and Sentinel traded near and far to all the ports of Tamriel. In my father's hall of business in Wayrest, I learned of the tracking of shipments, the balancing of accounts, the fluctuation of currencies. But Emeric of Cumberland knew the nature of the world, and he was not content to have his son learn only of the way of peace and trade. Every morning I sparred with the Cumberland Master of Arms, and every afternoon, the weather permitted, I rode a warhorse, exercising with the Menavia Heavy Dragoons. It wasn't just practice. For 2 months every summer I travelled as lieutenant on the mounted escort of the Evermore caravan, and half a dozen times we fought off hill bandits, goblin raiders, and reachmen warbands. I was fortunate to have spent so much time with a hilt in my hand, for in 2E 541, when I was but 20, Dukorak the Black Drake spread his wings in the Reach and mustered his feral tribesmen to war. Erupting from their mountain lairs like ants from a kicked anthill, the Reachmen howled down into Bancorai, burning and looting. After only 3 days' siege, Evermore fell to this horde. The land was pillaged and its people massacred. Hallin's Stand held a little longer, but eventually it was also overrun by the heathen swarm. Within days, they were across the Bjolse and heading down upon Wayrest. Then all were grateful that King Gardner had built new walls and battlements around Wayrest, for the town had grown so that it had burst the bounds of the old walls. Throngs of people swarmed in from the countryside, and soon it seemed that all Menevia, Gavadon, and Alcair were within the city walls. But when the Reachmen's storm burst open Wayrest, the crowded conditions seemed a small price to pay for the protection from the fury of those Daedra-loving heathens. Thus began the epic siege of Wayrest, when, for 57 days and nights, the Bretons of Stormhaven manned the walls and repulsed the savage assaults of our terrible opponents. The Reachmen, lacking in siege engines, were unable to breach our new walls and take the city by storm. And, lacking the ships, they were unable to blockade our harbour and reduce the city by starvation. Stalemate. Was Dukorak's invasion of High Rock at an end then? Indeed, no. Your Reachman warrior, though fearless and fierce, is not as a rule very patient. The Black Drake left enough troops in the revetments around our walls to keep us bottled up inside and simply marched off west into Glenumbra. Taken by surprise, the newly independent city-state of Camlorn fell and was sacked, and then Dukorak turned his eyes south towards Daggerfall. Fortunately, King Gardner heeded my advice to use our merchant ships as transports for the heavy dragoons. That was how I found myself at the head of the lances of Wayrest's finest as we charged into the rear of the Reachmen massed before Daggerfall's city gates. All Bretons know how the Black Drake's warriors were caught completely by surprise, how I smote Dukorak and tore down his unholy banner. They know of the sortie of the Knights of Daggerfall, in which King Bergamot finished the work we'd begun, scattering the broken army of heathens like autumn leaves before a gale. Only 1 fortnight after that, I watched, head bowed, as the kings of Daggerfall, Camlorn, Shornhelm, Evermore, and Wayrest signed the First Daggerfall Covenant. And so, my friends, with Chapter 3 at an end, it is time for us to begin Chapter 6, Rancer's War, Wayrest Besieged. Ever since my ascension to the throne of Wayrest, in that monstrous year of 2E 563, the question of who should become my queen consort was ever on my mind, and my advisors' minds. King Rancer of Shornhelm had a goodly daughter, Princess Rael, and her hand was offered to me by my brother of Shornhelm both early and often. Indeed, my mind was almost made up to accept the Princess of Shornhelm when, on a visit to Sentinel, my eyes first beheld the Princess Mariah, daughter of King Faharajad. From that moment I swore that Wayrest would have no queen but Mariah. Of course, there was another unexpected benefit. As her dowry, she brought a trade agreement between our two states that resulted in a great prosperity for all. King Rancer, alas, was wroth that I had not accepted the hand of his daughter. and he withdrew his ambassador from our court at Wayrest. Although Rancer was invited to my wedding to Moriah in the spring of 566, like the other kings of the Covenant, he stayed, seething in Shornhelm. I should perhaps have paid more attention to Rancer's collar, but I was so taken with my new bride and trade issues around the Iliac Bay that mountainous Shornhelm seemed distant and irrelevant. That mistake almost cost me my throne. For over a year, Rancer had been quietly mustering his troops and emptying his treasury to hire mercenaries. In the last siege of 2E 566, he led his army out of Shornhelm in a lightning strike to the south. Rancer had marched through Alcair and Menevia almost before we were aware of his approach. The Shornhelm advance guard had reached the gates of Wayrest while the local militias we had quickly mustered were still filing through them. This was a moment when history trembled upon a cusp. If the attacking Old Gate Lancers scattered our militia and took the gate, Wayrest could fall to her attackers within the hour. Fortunately, I was personally present at the gate, along with my Cumberland Guard. Recognizing the gravity of the situation, I had my bannermen sound the charge. I led the gate guards and my household troops out against the Old Gate Lancers. My men wore full armor, and I, though unarmored, bore at my side the mighty Oracle Scalpel, an enchanted broadsword of many virtues. The scalpel, drawn for the first time in anger, flashed and hummed like a blade in a sawmill as we hurled ourselves upon the Lancers. Our enemies, who suddenly found themselves opposed by armored veterans rather than panicky irregulars, were further confounded by the sudden onset of a thunderstorm. Lashed by hail, their horses terrified by lightning, faced with the Oracle Scalpel scything through their necks and limbs, the vaunted Old Gate Lancers hesitated, then broke and ran, pell-mell from the gate. By the time Rancer's main forces arrived on the scene, our troops were all within the walls. The gates were shut up tight, but the King of Shornhelm was undeterred. The city of Wayrest found itself once more under siege, and Rancer, with more craft and forethought than the Reachman de Corach, had come with siege engines in his train. And so, my friends, with Chapter 6 at its conclusion, we will end today's session with Chapter 10, The Summons of Destiny. And that, dear reader, is my story. You have now read of my carefree youth in Cumberland House, how my father, Lord Pierrick, saw to my training in the crafts of trade, of war, and of state, of my first great victory over de Corach at the gates of Daggerfall, and of the vast orichalcum load our family struck in Cumberland Mine. You have heard of the tragic coming of the Knahattan flu, how it both took my father and the entire royal family of Wayrest, leaving our kingdom leaderless in a time of chaos. You now know with what reluctance I was persuaded to assume the throne of Wayrest. You know of the halo of gold that outlined the sun on the day of my coronation. That omen of approval by the divines dispelled all my doubts and converted even my most envious rivals into heartfelt allies. You have now learned of the true history of Rancer's war and how it led to the second or greater Daggerfall Covenant, embracing the Red Guards of Hammerfell as well as the Orcs of Orsinium, who came to our aid in our hour of most dire need. The free peoples of northwest Tamriel vowed to stand together against all threats, be they from within or without. We were soon tested. In 2E 578, the Emperor Varan, with whom I had concluded a treaty, disappeared from the imperial city, and Cyrodiil once again fell under the pall of the Daedric Cabal. In Varan's unexplained absence, the Empress Clivia, a descendant of the savage Reachmen, assumed the Ruby Throne. Since then, the heart of the Empire has fallen into madness, murder, and decay. It is fortunate for our people, indeed for all peoples of Tamriel, that the true flame of the Empire of Man still burns in the Daggerfall Covenant. These are terrible times, but our destiny lies before us, as straight and true as Remen roads. We must march on Cyrodiil, overthrow the false Empress and all her brood, and restore the Empire of Tamriel. Then, once more peace and justice will rule over the provinces, rather than blood and fire. And so, adventurers, travelers, lore hunters, and wayward souls, I hope you enjoyed today's story, and please, come back for more.